Delighted to have my good friend and colleague from Breakspear here today, all the way from Whistler. He is here today to tell us some ideas around brain spectrum. Michael is very broadly trained in medicine, math, and psychiatry. He is currently in Newcastle. He's I'm going to say I know that. Systems Neuroscience Group. Imaging Center is the beautiful place down the city of
a wonderful country,
which means
flat.
So I'm not sure if it's as beautiful as our campus, but I'm sure it's comparable. But anyway, yeah, Michael has a very broad perspective, which is helpful in being able to communicate difficult concepts around dynamics, systems theory, but also being able to put it in the context of important problems around psychiatry. In this particular case, the relationship between brain function and metabolics. So with that, I'm delighted to let Michael now tell us the story.
Thank you. Okay, and thanks everybody for coming and online. I'll try and keep this fairly high level. I don't know everyone's background. There's a little bit of maths in there and physics, but this is probably one of our most successful projects, I think, as it came full circle. So I think it's nice to present. As Randy said, this was my group about a year ago. We're a bit bigger now. This is right next to our imaging centre. This is beautiful Biophysical country. So in Australia, many of us are on a journey to learn more about the Indigenous nations that were in Australia before many people from Europe arrived and other countries now. There are over 250 different language groups living for many tens of thousands of years in a sustainable manner on country, and there's still a lot of knowledge about country, and it's something that my group is definitely embracing. And since this photo, we've got some Indigenous research fellows, and we're learning more and more as we go forward about the beautiful Biophysical country, and that's the country around Newcastle where we live. How full is the brain's petrol tank? So this is a walk through a long series of studies that we've recently stitched into a story, I think. So the talk is in 3 parts. I'm going to talk about what I call the physics of stuff, very general principles of how systems exist when you put energy into them. This is background to some work we then did on these little neonates. This is my colleague's baby who gave us the data. These are kids born, not in this photo, but with quite a lot of hypoxia at birth, and it's a very perilous time in the journey of these young humans. And more recently, how we're pulling all of this together with some biophysical modelling. So, the physics of stuff. What do I mean by this? Oh, it looks like I'm going to give a background to this first. So as I said, the background is basically, I was visited by a Finnish paediatric neurophysiologist, Samsa van Hartelo, and we had common interests. And he had all this electroencephalographic data from extremely preterm infants and also infants born at full time but during hypoxia. And up to 50% of these preterm and hypoxic infants have intraventricular hemorrhage, and this often leads to disability at 2 years or in some sad cases to death in the first few days of life. And unfortunately there's no good predictive bedside tests in the first hours of life that will predict outcome. So the electrical activity must transition in these babies from basically, this is nothing other than amplifier noise. These are recordings from the clinic. There's about a day for them to transition through to full continuous EEG, looking healthy, and if they don't, then they're really in perilous state. And they go through this very characteristic transition called burst suppression. So they begin to exhibit these erratic bursts of electrical activity, which become more and more frequent, and then transition to this continuous EEG. This is called burst suppression. So what are we going to look at in a very simple way to approach this problem and work with SAMHSA on these neonatal recordings? So you can think of the brain at these babies have no electrical activity. So as far as the cortex is going, the neurons, there's no energy in the system. And then as they begin to breathe up and oxygenate and replenish the disturbed metabolic surrounds of the brain, the energy comes back into the cells. It fires up, I guess, the hypoxic cycle, the Krebs cycle. It starts to pump potassium and sodium and can start to fire. And in this setting, we're just looking at putting energy into a system at this stage. We're going to not worry about any of the biology of the baby. We're going to step right back. And there's reasons that we did this. And this is a common thing that we can do, that physicists do. They just simply record the sound of the system, the sound, whatever it is. It could be electrical activity, it could be magnetic bursts of activity. We're having one large-scale recording. We're not delving into the system. So believe it or not, these little bits of the system are interacting, and then we're putting in energy in them. This can tell us a lot about the type of interactions that are in the system. And the canonical way that physicists have studied this is by taking a ferromagnetic rod and putting a coil around it and starting to induce an external field, and then recording what happens with this induced voltage. Now, the way this is modelled is with spinning dipoles. These are bigger than individual subatomic particles, and each dipole starts to spin. Well, they're spinning anyway. As you put this external field, you tend to make the dipole line up with the external field, and they also interact with the neighbouring dipoles. So this is a very simplified way of studying this. It's my first equation, but basically the current is the end result of this smoothly changing field, the interaction between the neighbours, and then the fact that there's some sort of noise in the system. It can just be thermal noise, which is causing them to randomly flip, or it can be some irregularities in the lattice that they sit on. This is called the icing system. And the field and interactions tend to align the spins into common domains, and the heat and impurities tend to disrupt those domains and cause some disorder. So when there's no interactions, there's high disorder. Now I need to sort of turn this on. It's going to cause a lot of interference here. Yeah, I can't do it. It's just a hissing sound. That's the sound of hissing. That's the sound of a system in which there's things rattling around, but they're not interacting. So there's no collective activity at all in the system. And if we record it, it looks like this. And if we square the amplitudes and we look at the energy, it looks like a Gaussian. This is just the central limit theorem that random components that aren't interacting sum to a Gaussian curve. And this is what happens if you turn the television on and it's not tuned in. Okay, so the next stage is these particles begin to interact. but there's still a lot of energy in the system. So they interact and they begin to clump, but then they can't hold the energy and they literally pop. And I hope you heard the popping noise. So they begin to get to some scale before they release energy. And this is what the output looks like. And this is an exponential probability distribution function. So if we plot the distribution of energy here, we get this shape. And you can describe that with a simple exponential function. Oops, I've touched the screen.
We just touch it again.
Somebody needs to touch it who knows what they're doing.
Middle part.
Near the X.
Should I do that? Oh no, not that one, that one. Okay.
Hey.
Yeah, and that's got a characteristic scale, that minus capital L. And this is actually what happens in rice bubbles, right? I don't know, do you have rice bubbles here?
Rice Krispies.
Rice Krispies. Everyone has to put their own spin on it. You probably serve it with your peanut butter jam or whatever you call it. So it's a really good analogy. The energy builds up in the rice bubble and it pops, but when one pops, it doesn't make the next one pop. So there's no transfer of energy. Now the next one is the interesting one. This is like it's a crackling noise. And you can imagine that the energy begins to build up and it begins to cascade through the system. So there's some probability that the energy will be discharged, but there's still some probability that neighbouring popcorn bits will get involved and the energy discharge will be bigger and bigger and bigger. And so when we look at this, there's no characteristic scale. These are scale free. They don't curve, they can be fit. And look, these are numerous examples of crackling noise in nature. I don't know about murmuration, I just put that up because it looks pretty. But certainly, like if you go to the cinema and you've just finished your packet of chips and you want to crush them, you can't do it quietly because it's a form of crackling noise. So as you begin to crush, you get a little bend, and it's some probability that that bend will cause neighbouring bits to bend, and that's why it crackles. These are very common. And then if you have a system that eventually all the energy is discharged at the size of the system, this is called snapping noise. And there it is. This is a big, like a lightning bolt coming out of a storm. Okay, so we can describe all of this with this icing model. And this is the interesting one. You can get this so-called Barkhausen noise or crackling noise, which is all through nature, earthquakes, forest fires, crispy packet chips, via stock exchange crashes. And physicists love this because you don't really need to worry about the actual details of the system. It's like the opposite of biology, where you can strip it all away and you find the same thing happening time and time again. And there's a universal scaling relationship between the size of the burst and how long they last. And these relationships are found in all these different systems. So at some point, the actual properties of the system don't seem to matter. All that matters is the combination of energy and interactions. Now, no system is infinite, and when you put these into a finite size, you get this tail. So this is something that we were interested in. You know that this is going to be something about the baby's brain, or I wouldn't have gone on this big segue. So this is the walking through the baby's recovery again. What we did is take this burst suppression, we looked at individual bursts and we scaled them up, and when we were like, oh, hang on, this looks like burst suppression. If we look at this burst and we zoom in here, we get these bursts. If we zoom in here, then we get these bursts if we zoom in here. So it looks like there's crackling noise, and I think actually if you play it, it sounds like crackling noise. So we did what the physicists did. We took the bursts, we counted the area under the curve, and we plotted the probability of them. This is called the cumulative distribution function, how often they occur, and you see bigger and bigger ones. And this is pretty amazing because if this was 1 millimetre, this would be 1 kilometre. So that's 6 orders of magnitude of electrical activity in these little babies' brains, which is huge. And then this is this universal relationship between the area of the burst and the duration of the burst. And then there's another relationship between that slope and that slope. And James Roberts is trained as a physicist, so he put all of this together. And sure enough, the slope of this minus this divided by this, which is, this is C is the slope of this, A is the scaling relationship of this. So A minus 1 and D minus 1 divided by D minus 1 is the slope of this. So it's a form of universality. And that means the system is completely stable, that it's got as much likelihood as going up as going down. So you just put noise into it, it's at this state of criticality. And it's doing this sort of random walk. Now, there's another statistic or another feature of these random walks is that if you look at a completely random walk, this is just noise going up and down and up and down. Oops, don't do that. They do cross 0. And if we take the 0 crossings and we just stretch and try and dilate them to be on the unit circle, and then we average them, even though they look very noisy, the average is a perfect semicircle. This is called the shape of a fluctuation. It's another thing that physicists love. And if you look at the very short ones, if we now clump the short ones and the medium ones and the very long ones and we average them together, they all fall on this perfect semicircle. This is like what's called a renormalization. So you take a curve and you stretch it and you restore the area under the curve, and you do that across different scales and they all collapse. It's like perfect symmetry. It's not quite E equals mc squared, but for statistical physicists it's just as good. So this is what we did with babies. We said, okay, what's the shape? We can take these bursts and we can look at the average. James, my PhD student, Kartik Iyer, did this, and this is what it looks like. Red is very short and blue is very long, and the other colours are in the between. And this is one baby and this is all babies. And so this is the progressively longer bursts, and we see they're not collapsing onto the universal circle. They're getting flatter or kurtotic, and they're getting skewed. So this is the skewness and this is the kurtosis. And
Michael, do you want to use the cursor? You can zoom and see what you're
okay, so this is the increasing increasing skewness and decreasing kurtosis. And this is what these scale-free curves look like. Now, looking at physics, I'm tempted to jump up. It's easy to get the flattening by just saying, instead of just being a completely random walk, now there's what's called a restoring term, which is in the opposite direction to the walk. So the walk gets big, then this pushes it back to the origin. And the walk goes in the negative direction, it pushes it up. And if we add that to our random walks, you get the flattening. So you get the flattening, but you don't get the skewness. So we had a lot, I might say, of thinking about this. How do we get it to go left? Now, the key insight is it goes left more the longer the bursts last, which means they come out very quickly. They're like out of the, it's like kids racing 100 metres. Gates open, kids take off, the burst is taking off. It gets about halfway along, and this restoring term gets stronger and stronger. So that doesn't happen very much for the short bursts, but for the long bursts, this restoring force gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So this complicated looking equation is the damping term, and it says basically this is x squared, which is the energy of the system, and this is a little memory. How long in the past, do we remember how much energy the system has? Oops, I should be using my cursor. This is x squared, and this is a little memory term. So this is the energy, and this is how long it remembers. And when we add that to our equation, we get mathematically babies. Maths, babies. Looks pretty good, huh? And then when the kids who recover, they get these universal bursts. So this restoring term goes back to 0, and you get the perfect walks. Okay, so this is all fine and dandy. This is what I was just talking about. It's just above the metabolic floor. So it bursts out, but as soon as the electrical activity kicks in, it starts running out of energy, and it loses, and it just comes down back to baseline. So the next thing we did is see, does this work? What does it mean about the kids? Some of the babies recovered, some of them had hemorrhages, and some of them passed away. Some of them were born very early, and some of them weren't born very early. And we found that the amount of skewness and flattening were really good predictors, first of all, of when they were born. So the later they were born, the more the skewness, and the deeper. Oh, sorry, is this gestational days? What's going on here? Yeah, the later they were born, the more these shapes changed, which suggests that this compromise in the metabolic restoring force is worse for the very preterm babies. And they change in the first 72 hours after birth. And what's really interesting is that we look at this thing called the MDI, developmental index, the motor developmental index. These burst statistics, skewness and kurtosis, shows a really good relationship with how these young people were doing at 2 years. No, around sigma. And we could put this into a receiver operating curve and found that they are really, really good predictors of outcome. And we could compare it to ultrasound, which was done at 3 to 4 days, and then graded in terms of severity. And you can see the more severe the intraventricular hemorrhage, the more abnormal these bursts. So no intraventricular hemorrhage, no compromise, greater and greater intraventricular hemorrhage, greater and greater compromise. And these are the receiver operating curves for no marginal and full intraventricular hemorrhage. So then we published this in more clinical journals. And we even got a patent, my only ever patent. It's a method, Gerd, it's a patent. There it is. Our business development unit loved it. And then we got it licensed to an Icelandic neurophysiological company. And they had to pay our institute quite a lot of money. I didn't get any money. But they haven't developed it yet. We don't quite know what's happened to Kavicna. But anyway, I was pretty excited by all of that. Now I'm going to go, anyone have any questions? That's where the story ended about 4 years ago. Good. So now we're going to close the story. As I said, we had this random walk, that's the randomness, and that's the restoring term. And the restoring term got stronger and stronger as energy was expressed by the system, and that gave this leftward skew and the damping. And then that's just a sort of made-up equation. It's a phenomenal log, a heuristic equation. It doesn't relate to the underlying biology. So this work is by a PhD student who just graduated last month, Shrey Dutta. I should really have his photo here. Maybe I'll show a photo later on. And this is what we've done in the last 3 years. So we've taken a model of the neuron. This is the Hodgkin-Huxley model, the famous Nobel Prize winning model. Oops, sit back down. Sure. This is just the conductance across the cell with all the sodium, potassium chloride, and inputs from a synapse. So this is the synaptic current, and these are all the ion currents. And there is also sometimes a leaky current. The form of these equations isn't really important at this stage. Then there are going to be, as you'll see, a few hundred neurons in this little local network. So each neuron in the network is connected to many other neurons, and that's where this synaptic current comes from. That's just making them all connected with each other. And then the key thing that we did for the first time in this study is add, of course, you never see this, very, very rarely in computational neuroscience. This key coupling, like these ion pumps that are putting the sodium back outside the cell and the potassium back inside the cell, those pumps in the brain are like 20% of what we eat. Like, they're very energy intensive processes. And these are a bunch of first order equations that basically says you need oxygen. You need oxygen to get these pumps working. If you don't, this row gets small, the pumps aren't at their full capacity, and then the sodium and potassium, which rely on these pumps, slow down. I must admit, I still am a bit perplexed because there's so many of these equations, but Shrey understands all of them. But the key thing is oxygen goes down, this parameter goes down, the parameter goes down, the pumps go down, the pumps go down, sodium and potassium get compromised. So off we went, and we wanted to see if we could manipulate two of these parameters, the oxygen bath, the buffer, and the potassium buffer, this one. These are the two things. These are out here. This is the cell. These have to diffuse into the cell and then run these pumps. So we're going to put all of this together and we're going to manipulate these parameters, and that'll be the rest of my talk. Now, when the parameters are in a healthy regime, this is our 400 neurons, 320 pyramidal cells and 80 local inhibitory cells. This is called asynchronous irregular activity. This is what the normal activity of our brain frequently looks like. There's some sort of rhythm, but basically there's not a lot of coherence. You see some coherence. But what's really cool here, which is a key thing, yada, 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 this is the coolest part of this diagram. This is the balance between the excitation and the inhibition. And you can see it's close to zero. So although you've got a lot of pyramidal cells and inhibitory cells firing, they're more or less cancelling each other out. So you can imagine when they're cancelling each other out, they're very vulnerable to noise. They're going to go up and down with noise. That's where this critical aspect of this system comes from.
Offset the time between the two currents, the currents?
Not in this, not really. Tiny little offset. They're pretty much completely balanced. And this is one of the common things that you see in the brain, balance at the neuron level between excitation and inhibition, which you, by the way, see is quite disturbed in dementia, in Alzheimer's disease, as you no doubt are aware. And then if we increase the potassium, and decrease the oxygen, we go straight into this burst suppression. So this is really, really, really close to balanced, but then there's a threshold when the oxygen recovers and the cortex goes completely crazy until it uses up all of the oxygen and then it can't fire again. So it's quiet, it gets enough oxygen pumped back in, the EI balance is chaotic and unbalanced, and it fires as much as it can, and then it runs out of oxygen, and that's called burst suppression. And then there's another regime here where it doesn't fire quite as crazily, but it still depletes the oxygen and the potassium, and it has this kind of activity that looks very much like an epileptic seizure that lasts often for several minutes of simulated time. So seizures, burst suppression, and AI behaviour. And we can then look at where these occur in the space spanned by oxygen and potassium. There's very abrupt boundaries between the three different types of activity, and this is isosynchronous. So this is death, basically. And there's a small part over here where you can have AI or ISO. So that's bistable. Now, what we can do is we can go right across this parameter space and we can simulate thousands of recordings, and we can then extract the bursts from, for example, burst suppression, and we can put them through those metrics that we got from our earlier studies. And we can then take a real baby's data, and we got 5 of these metrics: the average shape, there's 2 of those, remember, skewness and kurtosis, then these scaling relationships. And so we can triangulate where in this two-dimensional parameter space we think that baby sits, just by matching simulated and empirical data. And so this is what Shrey did. Just from 5 minutes of data, real data, you can pretty much guess what the potassium and oxygen would be if that data was generated by the model. So here's a lot of examples, data and model, and then we can say, because we had a lot of recordings, as the baby's recovering in the first 24 hours, it's kind of doing little movement through this parameter space. And I think we've got some movies of this. Yeah, so this is a baby going through parameter space, exhibiting burst suppression, as you can see here. That's the data, that's the model. This baby had a very poor outcome. We can do the same thing for many poor outcomes. We can do the same thing for a good outcome. We can do the same thing for many good outcomes. And what we saw is, not surprisingly, the babies with a good outcome tended to get away from this initial area. They sort of traversed back towards that asynchronous, irregular type of activity. And in fact, if we looked at the difference between the starting and the ending potassium, we got a reasonable statistical separation. And this is not something that we measured. This is like what we call a computational assay. This is something that we think is happening if the model was true. Yeah, that's basically it. What it means is, well, I mean, these days with all fast food and McDonald's and energy resources in what we ate, Randy and I had focaccia for lunch. We don't really have to worry about the metabolic resources, but in the good old days, when we were pre-industrial revolution, we did have to worry about that. And there was a cost associated with how much time you'd spend hunting and gathering and storing up all this energy in your brain. So you don't want to go around like in a car, like with a battery, that would see you for 5 weeks, because you're going to have a huge battery in the back of the car or a petrol tank. And that's the same thing in the brain. There's got to be some optimal amount of energy that we put away in the brain's petrol tank. And most of the time that's fine. But if you have hypoxia at birth, or you have a hypoxia due to a stroke, or in some forms of dementia, we sometimes see burst suppression or seizure activity in the hippocampus. You go and you burn into this petrol tank and get these irregular activities. Oh, yeah, okay. So these were the colleagues that worked on the earlier part, that's SAMHSA, and this is Shrey in India back in 2016 or 17. And this is his PhD paper, which will hopefully be published in Nature Communications. We've just got one round of reviews left. So thank you.